I have no idea how long I was on mute. I'm very sorry. Can somebody ask how long was I on mute?
They don't care.
Yeah, they don't care.
Okay, let me summarize. I will summarize. We're here tonight to talk about the Prop 218 benefit assessment process. This is informational only. We've checked with County Council. There's no Brown Act conflict or violation in your attendance here this evening. If you're a commissioner, I'm going to ask Chief Zane to keep an eye on that red microphone for me if it goes red again. Please let me know. We are about to get the festivities started. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box. If you do not have the ability to type, please raise your hand. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Bliss with SCI Consulting, who is going to get us started. So thank you again very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elisa, and thank you all for coming. My name is John Bliss. I'm president of a small company in Fairfield in Solano County, right nearby, called SCI Consulting. And we have about 25 employees, and we have a weird specialty. And our specialty is to help local governments in California with funding. And we work with lots of fire districts. So we've done about, over the last 10 years, we've done about between 30 and 40 Proposition 218 benefit assessments for fire districts, mostly in rural areas, mostly in districts with from 100 parcels up to 10,000 parcels, something like this. And so we're happy to be here. We feel fortunate that the county has decided to chose us to help you all out. Today is going to be informational. We're going to talk. We apologize in advance. We'll talk for about 20 minutes. And we have a presentation. We think that'll answer most of the questions. And so if you can just give us a little bit of space right at the beginning, we think we can go over everything that's going to kind of happen. And then we're going to have plenty of time for discussion and questions afterwards. I'm going to introduce my colleagues. Jeanette Henson, who's going to raise her hand here. She's a Vacaviller, and she's going to be the project manager. Ryan Austin is going to help out with data, and Valerie Flores will also help out with data and engineering. But I'm going to kind of tell you what we're engaged in, what we're trying to do. The county did an unusual thing. It's the only county we know in the state that decided to step forward and push and coordinate and fund the idea of replacing and updating this weird instrument called a Proposition 218 compliant benefit assessment. We're going to give you what that really means. We're going to talk about that. And so the county has volunteered to fund all of this. And we're doing a lot of these. We're doing up to 15 at the same time. There's going to be areas where we will work in parallel that all of you need similar information like tonight. But there's as many or more areas where we're going to be working with you individually. We know each of you have different populations, cultures, histories, demographics, service levels, service goals, and types of services. And so the first kind of phase of this is actually information gathering and information sharing. So we're trying to give you enough information tonight that when we ask you for information, you'll be able to provide it. So kind of the next step after this will be, we'll identify, we'll probably broadly send out a questionnaire to each of you, and we plan on doing an interview or a number of interviews with each of the district to get your kind of information. We anticipate that there's the full range. Some of you are in fantastic shape. Your Proposition 218 engineers report may be in great shape and you're well funded, all the way to some of you don't have an engineer's report, or the engineer's report wouldn't meet today's legality or wouldn't give you enough revenue, and everything in between. And so we know you're all different, and so we'll be working on doing all of that, all of that separately with you all. So I talked a little bit about document. I'm going to dive in. Was there anything else I needed to say? Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what the process looks like. And I'm going to talk tonight about the process. Some of you will go through kind of the whole process, and I'm going to talk about that, and we're going to present what that whole process is and looks like. But we want you to know, for some of you, you may not require that. There may not be the need or the political viability or for lots of reasons. And so what is this process we're talking about? The goal is straightforward. It is to establish a sustainable, yearly, significant revenue source for you. Fire services are funded by state grants. Some of you have different types of fees, ambulance fees, all types of things. And most fire districts in California are primarily funded by two sources. One we call the property tax, we call it the ad valorem. That's your percentage locked in. If you're fortunate enough to have it, it's usually too small, but it was locked in 1978 as part of the property tax. And that's a good, reliable source for you. And that will continue into perpetuity. Then, depending on the district, you have a second mechanism. Almost every district in California has some second mechanism. Sometimes it's a tax, but in most cases, it's a Proposition 218 benefit assessment. And so we're going to be evaluating and working with you all to see if there should be an update and increase, a new assessment for you. And so what is Proposition 218? So Proposition 218 is, people throw the term around meaning lots of things. Most people you talk to that talk to you about Proposition 218 do not know what they're talking about. It is misused and it is described incorrectly all the time. So I'm going to try to de-glamorize it. It's essentially about 10 pages of language that was approved by voters back in 1996. And it's a set of rules. It's a set of rules on how local governments can establish a funding mechanism that they typically collect on the property taxes. If you look at your property tax, you have all those lines of fees, taxes, assessments. And what we're looking at as a portion of it. The 1% of your ad valorem of your assessed value you're going to get, but we're going to establish, we're going to either not touch, or we're going to rehabilitate and improve or put in a new line of a benefit assessment. So Proposition 218 describes several different mechanisms. So when someone says, I got to do a Prop 218, that doesn't tell you much. Within Prop 218, one of the main mechanisms to look at, and the one we're going to use, is called a benefit assessment or a special assessment. And it has certain requirements to it that you have to go through. And the requirements include an engineering study called an engineer's report. It's the most boring, awful report you'll ever see. I'm a licensed civil engineer, and that's required to write it, but it doesn't have much engineering. It's budgeting, it's services, and it's justification. It's a 20 or 30 or 40 page report that's a requirement to go forward with an assessment. It has a lot of information that is for legal defensibility, but the most important information for all of you is it has what we call the rate methodology. And that is, what is the different property, how are the different property types assessed? And let me give you an example. Typically, the term we use most often, and most often is a single family equivalent or a single family house, a single family resident. And so if someone says, how much was the benefit assessment? And they say it's $100, it's usually per single family home. Most of you have lots of single family home. Some of you have mostly ag. There is some commercial in the districts, there's some vacant lot, but you guys are primarily commercial, or single family residents and ag. Agricultural acres, we typically assess on a per acre. So it might be 10 cents an acre, it might be $1 an acre, something like that. And single family homes are typically a flat rate. We have different rates for vacant and commercial and all of those types of things. And those are all in a table in that engineer's report. That's a very, very important part of it. The second part of it is and that engineer's report gets reviewed and approved by your governing board. Some of you, it's the county, and some of you have independent boards. And so all of that kind of happens. That and my colleague Jeanette's going to show you some examples of what I'm talking about, but I'm kind of giving you a preface. We have an engineer's report, we get it approved, then we go to the second step, which is a balloting. And so there is a balloting, it's a property owner balloting, it's a 45-day property owner balloting, and it's a 50% threshold. So if 50% of your properties vote yes, then this is approved. But I've oversimplified because it's a little more complicated than that. It's a 50% threshold of the returned ballots. That makes sense, this 45-day mail balloting. And they're weighted by their proposed assessment. So what does that mean? Let's say I've got a single family home and I live in Esparto, and I have a single family home. And Esparto, as you guys know, has some residential suburban kind of subdivision neighborhood. So I have a single family home and I live in Esparto, and I've got one house. But my brother-in-law, and so I get a ballot and it has the parcel number and it says $100. My brother-in-law, he owns 3 houses. All of them are also in Esparto. And so his ballot actually has 3 parcels on it, and it says 100, 100, 100. So he has $300 worth of assessment. He has 300 votes. I only have one vote. So think of it as $1 a vote. The larger property owners have to pay more, but they get to vote more. And then when the Jarvis Taxpayers Association created this mechanism, they wanted it to be fundamentally fair. And their idea was, hey, if you're gonna have to pay more, you should be able to vote, have more voting power. And so that's the system that we have in California, good or bad, and it seems to be an effective system. And so that balloting happens. And then the third part of that, so we've got the engineering, we've got all the preliminary planning, we've got the engineer's report, we've got the balloting, and parallel to that, there's another task that's going to happen. And my colleague Ryan's going to give you just an introduction to it today, which is community outreach, because this is a Proposition 218 benefit assessments are an administrative exercise, they're an engineering exercise, but they're also a political exercise. And to tell you the truth, the biggest challenge for many communities, particularly rural fire districts, is the political. Is your community interested in increasing their investment in fire services? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. In some ways, it looks and feels like a typical political campaign. In some ways, it's different because it's focused on property owners, not voters. We know property owners, particularly in more conservative rural California, they are really big on facts and numbers and information. So it's not a raw vote yes cheerleader type effort. It's a face-to-face, numeric, rigorous type of effort. So with that, I'm going to pass off to Jeanette. She's going to come up and some of what she's going to say is repetitive, but we want to kind of, she's going to go through the mechanism of what that Proposition 218 process looks like.
Hang on for a second. I just want to check in with our Zoomers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was I?
I'm happy
to repeat it, but I don't think anyone here wants me to repeat it.
No, I'm going to ask those of you on Zoom, if one of you, I think Linnell and Chad were both typing in the chat earlier, if you could just type in real quick and just let us know if everything's going well. Not getting anything. Oh, Chief Lopez says, I can hear fine, thanks. Perfect.
Okay,
Then I'm going to turn it. I apologize for the interruption. I'm going to turn it over to Jeanette now. Thanks, guys.
No problem. Hi, I'm Jeanette Henson. I'm a consultant at SCI Consulting Group, and I'm just going to talk a little bit more in depth on some of the requirements of Proposition 218.
Do you want me to advance the slide, please?
Yeah, I can do it. That's okay. We've talked about a lot of this already, but Proposition 218 requires an engineering study, and the primary purpose of the engineering study is to establish the services that are needed, create a budget that will meet those services, and determine what your funding requirements are. You also, the other requirement is that you quantify the amount of special benefit that property receives. And the way we, one of the ways we do that is one of the next steps that we do is we create a database of all of the parcels in your district, and then we analyze all of these parcels and look at certain factors and assign benefit units to parcels based on some of the things that John talked about. We look at parcel size, we look at property use type, and we look at the number of dwelling units that are on a parcel. And then we, so then we get the total number of benefit units that are what that would be in your district. And then from there, we can take the total funding need to meet the service levels that you need, and come up with the assessment rate that, the base assessment rate that you would need to go out for. Okay, so once the engineer's report is complete, then it's submitted to the board for preliminary approval. And at that time, the board can decide if they want to order the Proposition 218 mailed ballot proceeding. So at that time, it's required that an agency provide 45 days notice of a public hearing and mail a ballot to all of the property owners that would pay an assessment. So ballots are mailed to all of the property owners and they get 45 days to vote. Oh yeah, so
My
here's
screen.
the sample ballot. So some of the requirements of the ballot is that you're required to have the address where the ballot is supposed to be returned. You clearly have to have a yes and a no, and the question, I approve the proposed assessment for fire protection and emergency response services. This is a ballot we actually used in a measure that we worked on a couple of years ago in Santa Cruz County. So wait, go back one more. So you also have to have instructions on how to complete the ballot, where the public hearing is, and when the ballot is due. You go. You also have to have the property owner's name printed on it, and then all of the parcel numbers, all the parcels that property owner owns, and how much they have to pay for each parcel. And then as John was talking about, that would be the total weight of the vote of this ballot. So this particular ballot has about 10 parcels and they're all weighted at $148. So that's how much the vote of this ballot would be. Along with the ballot, a notice and information guide is required to be sent. And there are certain requirements for the notice and information guide. You have to include specific information about the assessment. Usually include some information about the district, voting instructions, how to cast your ballot. Usually you have some information in there about your funding challenges, what your funding needs are, what services are going to be paid for with this assessment, whether or not it has a CPI, and what the rates are for different property types. Then it also includes information on how to participate in the public hearing. Okay, so here's an example of the outgoing envelope. So you have to have printed on there. One of the requirements is official ballot enclosed. That's one of the requirements for the outgoing envelope. You also have to include a envelope where you can seal your ballot up and keep it secret until the end of the 45-day ballot period. So ballots can't be opened until the end of the 45 days after the end of the public input portion of the public hearing. So after the 45 days, like we said, you have 45 days to cast your ballot. That's required, a minimum of 45 days. There's a public hearing must be held. And at that public hearing, property owners have an opportunity to come in, ask questions about the assessment or vote, their opinion, whether opposed or in favor of the assessment, so that the board can consider all of that before they vote on the assessment. We recommend that the ballots would be tabulated by an independent third party that has no stake in the outcome. Typically, the county clerk is a good example of a tabulator. So after the end of the 45 days, you can open the ballots and start tabulating them. But before the 45 days, all the ballots have to stay sealed. And as John explained earlier, all of the ballots are weighted by the amount that you have to pay. And it just takes a weighted majority of the property owners for a successful outcome. So there's 50 plus 1%.
Excellent. So why don't we, thank you, Jeanette, and why don't we have Ryan, why don't you come up and talk a little bit about outreach? And
I had a mark to stand on here.
Oh, yeah,
I think
sorry,
I
did we
probably
move around
failed
too
at
much?
Standing in the right
I think
place.
that should work, Ryan.
Am I not blocking the screen there? That works.
Actually, you are pretty perfect.
Okay,
There you
okay,
go.
fantastic. And so as Ryan is getting set up,
Oh, what happened? There.
okay, as Ryan is getting set up, again, we're kind of telling you, just giving you a 30,000-foot overview of the process for the group of you that would go forward with the entire assessment if some of you are going to end up doing that. It doesn't apply to everyone. We just wanted to give you a sense of what a typical associated outreach would be. And so do you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. I'll be
got
your
it?
first slide.
So right here.
Okay.
So hey, everybody, as John mentioned, this is kind of, we're going to go through kind of some of the approaches that you would take with outreach that's kind of occurring at the same time as you go through the balloting process, the engineer's report and all that. So essentially, the way this is typically best approached is very straightforward, especially in smaller communities. So it's really just a chance to tell your story. And so you want to really focus on the services you provide, on budget challenges that you have, on what would be gained, if a ballot measure would have passed, what would be lost if it didn't, that sort of thing. And really kind of tell that story as straightforward as you can. And with that comes, the need for financial detail, rigorous financial detail. Really kind of making it clear why there is that financial need. And then, of course, authenticity, accuracy, and transparency are all key here. You don't want something to be too glitzy, too showy, too done up. You really want to be able to kind of sit down with people, look them in the eye, and tell them the truth, tell them the story. You go to the next one. So with this kind of community outreach, there's really kind of three buckets here. So you have community meetings, and then you have direct outreach, which is kind of reaching out directly to stakeholders, community leaders, that kind of thing. And then you have general outreach, which is flyers, FAQ flyers, websites, social media. So you kind of have these three kind of buckets here in terms of the way to go about this. The next one. So for the community meetings, I kind of touched on a few of these earlier, but service levels, that's obviously an important part of this. So what service levels you provide, what your goals are, where you want to get. And so that's something to highlight in those meetings. And then in terms of budgets, first, any efforts to minimize the budget made generally comes across well. People appreciate, that kind of perspective where they don't want to see, overspending. They want to see that you've been financially or fiscally responsible. And then also budgetary needs, again, kind of connecting that to the service levels, really making sure people understand that connection between the budget and the services you provide. And then really highlighting that connection, highlighting, where you want to be or where you've been and where you want to go, and the numbers financially that can get you there. And then again, optimal messaging focal points, rigorous financial analysis, again, service details, and again, transparency and authenticity.
Yeah, and let me kind of jump in here. For communities like yours, as we're hitting it pretty hard, showy, glitzy mailers, websites are not particularly effective. They're good and they certainly don't hurt. But this is individual personal meetings. It is particularly with large landowners because they have a lot of votes. It is community meetings that are regularly scheduled. It's that type of thing. It's not a quick, come on, let's vote yes. It's a slower, more detailed description of what your costs are, what your service level, what your goals are, what your plan is, that type of thing. That's what's effective in rural California, and particularly in more conservative rural California. There are certain messages that kind of resonate throughout the state and would likely resonate in your community. Maybe it's a little bit different, but emergency response, maintain emergency response services, maintain emergency medical response services. Those are very, very important, and that's probably the number one. One of the messages that we've seen emerge recently in the last 5 years for fire services, and I think it's very interesting, is retention of firefighters. So we didn't see this 10 years ago. There wasn't this concern about people and their jobs and their livelihood. So part of it is there's maybe a hunkering down, and particularly in rural California, people want to maintain, make sure that the firefighters are fairly compensated and have a job. And part of that is the issue that maybe some of you have, where the young firefighters are getting trained locally, and then they're leaving and bringing that institutional knowledge with them and going to an urban center and getting a higher paid job there. And that the smaller rural fire districts can't compete. So that's one of the things that we see people that is resonating well. The other one is to keep things local. And so we have this issue in California, as you all know, that when we set up the state, we have lots of small, single purpose, extremely knowledgeable on their area, extremely well connected with their community fire districts. And that model only works if those fire districts maintain a high level of service and are funded to do that. Frankly, as you know, we wouldn't be here. The state has not done a good job doing that, and it's been incumbent upon local residents to invest in their local fire district. Local residents strongly prefer, and you can do any survey, they strongly prefer a local fire district. It's very, very rare that a local resident says, we'd rather the county took over, or we'd rather the state or CAL FIRE contracted. That's really not particularly appealing. So one of the, probably the after emergency response and retention of firefighters, probably the third one is maintain local control. People want that. We also see maintaining and replacing aging equipment, those types of operational things. So those are kind of the things that likely would resonate. But in each case, if we get to that step with you, we would work with you in a variety of ways to kind of flesh out what is it in your community that's most appealing. So why don't you finish up and talk a little bit about some of the limitations on advocacy?
Yeah, so as John mentioned, not only is this not like a rah-rah vote yes, because that may not be as effective, but there are actually limitations on what public funds can be expended for in terms of advocating for a measure. And so typically these are more informational. They're more, thank you. They're more informational. They're really kind of, communicating facts, explaining again, what will happen with the loss of a measure, what will happen if a measure is successful, and publicizing factual information. And so if you go to the next one, John, too, we have some examples here. So this is a newspaper article that was written about North County Fire in Monterey County. You can see the picture there. This was a successful measure. It was a benefit assessment. And this is something, that can be helpful as well, kind of getting some local press, an interview with the right reporter, getting that information out there. And this article was not written in it wasn't an opinion piece. It kind of is just telling the story. If you go to the next one. So along with the assessment ballots, there will be an informational sheet made. And so this is an example of one of those informational sheets. You can see it just kind of has some general numbers. It talks about increase in service or increase in need in the community, things like that. And there are obviously different kinds of designs you can do. This is another one here. This is, I believe, another for Santa Cruz County. So there's kind of some different ways to go about that, but typically these are just informational, just kind of putting information out there. This next one is, I believe, an FAQ sheet. So this is a little more stripped down, a little more straightforward, less graphics, kind of just some general information in a basic way.
Let me read, actually, just to give you an example, I'll read some of these. How much did North County Fire Protection receive from CAL FIRE prevention, from the CAL FIRE prevention fee? North County Fire Protection District did not receive any funds from the CAL FIRE prevention fee. So we work out some kind of the common questions so that people know a good, concise response.
And so obviously, as we have more discussions with specific districts, we can find out kind of what the concerns may be in any given area, and we can try to kind of approach that accordingly for your individual communities or areas. This last one, I believe, is a phone script, which we can also do in terms of being able to take calls or make calls, with direct outreach, community leaders, stakeholders, that kind of thing. And yeah, I think that pretty much sums that up.
Great. So thank you. So why don't we, Elisa, why don't we open for some questions and answers now? And then we still have a couple more minutes of next steps we want to go over with you. But why don't maybe we put the Zoom people on first, and if you want to read off some of the questions, and my colleagues and I will try to answer them.
So for all of those of you zooming in, if you have any questions, I'm going to ask you to please put them in the chat box. If you do not have the ability to type into the chat box, can you please raise your hand? If we do not have any questions in the Zoom,
Okay.
We'll move to I'll keep my eye on the chat
Okay,
box.
that sounds great. Does anyone have any questions here in the live audience? Yes, sir. And actually, one of the things that Elisa and I had said, and I know you all know each other, but if you could tell us what district you're from, that would be great.
Yeah, Eric Zane, fire chief actually from the city of Woodland, but I represent the Spring Lake Fire Protection District as a contract district. So we currently do have a benefit assessment that was developed, I think, in 1997.
Okay, perfect.
No escalators, anything like that built into it, right? So my question is, if we go out, re-engineer, go to the voters, for some reason it gets turned down, does our current assessment remain in play?
Great question, and absolutely 100% it does.
Okay.
And there was, years ago, that was a concern, and there was actually some legal concern. That case is shut and closed. We would be very, very careful and write everything that maintains the current one, because we don't want to put that at risk. And so yes, that one is solid and locked in.
I have a question and a comment from the chat. I'll do the comment first and then I'll ask you the question. The comment was, will the meeting materials be available to everybody? And the answer to that is yes. I will send out the meeting materials, the PowerPoint presentation to all meeting participants. If I do not have your email address, which we discovered when we sent this invite out, we got a roster of all the commissioners from the clerk of the board's office. I had about 26 of them bounce back as invalid email addresses. So if you do not receive an email from me in the next 24 hours, I'm also going to have everything posted on the Yolo County website under the fire sustainability tab. The best way to find that is to open Google or the search engine of your choice, type in Yolo County Fire Sustainability. I've checked 3 different browsers. It's always the first hit. If you still cannot obtain the meeting materials, I'm also going to put my email address into the chat for you. And then finally, the video, the Zoom is being recorded, and I will post it to the county's webpage. So if you have commissioners or someone who was not able to be here tonight, you can go back and watch this at your leisure. Okay, now for the question. We had a question from the chat. If someone does not vote, so
Yeah.
the ballot comes in the mail and I throw it away, never return it, how is that ballot counted?
Great question. And so it's on that, actually, let me take one step back. And as Elisa said, she's always available to answer questions. Some of the questions would come to us. And so I'm also going to leave my business card with everyone, or I'll put it in front. You can get it at any time, particularly during this next couple of months. As you have questions, as your board members have questions, as your constituents do not hesitate to reach out to us. The county is paying us to answer your questions and give you this information. So we're happy to answer any questions. And let's get to this particular question. And that is, what happens if a ballot is not voted? And it's the same as any other election. In that case, it's just like any other election. It doesn't count as a yes or a no. And so let's say we had 100 parcels, and let's say everyone just owned one parcel. So we have 100 ballots and 50 of them are returned, and we would only evaluate those 50 that were returned. The ones that aren't returned are not part of the evaluation. So the 50 that are returned, we're going to open them and we're going to put them in 2 piles, the yes pile and the no pile. Then we're going to go through and sum up those dollars. When Ryan showed you those dollars, we're going to sum up all the dollars on the no pile, and we're going to sum up all the dollars on the yes pile. Whichever has more dollars wins. So if we had $2,000 worth of yes and $1,999 of no, then it passes.
So that's why, John, earlier you were saying it's 50% plus 1.
Yeah,
of
exactly.
The ballots
That's
returned.
Of ballots returned. So and this is how we say it. It's a 50% plus 1 of the returned ballots weighted by their proposed assessment. And that's a fancy way of saying $1, 1 vote, or 1 penny, 1 vote, if that makes sense. And that's how Jarvis set it up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Bill Bush, Dunnigan, Commissioner. Question I have is the list available of the voters and their weighted votes?
Yes. So let's talk about that. When Jarvis set this up, they had a kind of a little different approach, and that is they wanted it public. And so in some ways, the ballot is like an election. In some ways, it's like a letter from a property owner to the district, whether they want to do this or not. But let me give you some of the specifics. There's something called a levy roll. And so every engineer's report in Dunnigan, I think, what do you have, 500 parcels, something like that? 1,000 parcels, somewhere in there. Let's just say you have 1,000 parcels. As part of that engineer's report, for every one of those parcels, we're going to calculate their assessment. Is it a vacant lot? Is it a big ag? And so there's a dollar amount, and that's called the levy roll. So right in that engineer's report, there's going to be a table with all 1,000 parcels and that dollar amount. Then during the balloting, each one of those is mailed out. The issue of after those ballots are returned, our firm feels strongly that we protect the secrecy of that ballot. And so we would not allow the public to see how people voted. We think that's not consistent with the intent. There have been cases where people have tried to do a public records request and see how people voted one way or the other. And we have been able to either redact, which means cross out the names, or provide the information. So we want to be on that knife edge where our tabulation is transparent and auditable, but also protect the anonymity of the voter. Did that answer the question?
That's not what I wanted to hear.
What do you want to hear? That you could see how people voted?
No, I don't want to see how they voted, but I want to be able to, and we have some large landowners.
You'll know ahead of time who they are.
Yeah, and so, you know, if somebody has half the votes already.
We're going to have a meeting with
We
that
wanna make
person.
sure
Yeah,
they
that's
vote.
right. Exactly. So yes, absolutely. We have a whole levy roll, and part of what we do, it's not the most tactful name, but we call those heavy hitters. And it's extremely important because they're paying a lot of your assessment. It's extremely important that you engage them, give them the information so that they can make the right decision.
So that levy roll that you
Yeah.
described, what I've seen, and I'm by no means an expert though, in the districts that have 218s, is that after the 218 passes every year, that Board of Commissioners has to pass a resolution.
That's correct.
Certifying that the levy roll is
Yeah.
correct, and that it's sent to the Yolo County Assessor's Office. And the assessor is the one that puts that line item on their property tax bill.
For that parcel number. But yeah, that information is readily available, and it's very valuable information, as you correctly say. Everyone should get a lot of information before they make a decision, but particularly folks that have a big stake and oftentimes hopefully I'm wrong, but sometimes those large landowners are out of state or out of the area, and they're harder to get in touch with than the single family home. But we make every effort. We've got some approaches on how to do that.
On the assessment value, do they just do the property tax? Because, you know, we have about 6 different types of.
Great. So let me talk about that.
We got irrigation districts.
Right. One of the problems with Prop 218 that makes me pull my hair out is the word assessment, because the word assessment sounds like assessed value, and the assessed value, every property in the state has an assessed value. That's how much it's worth. This is a totally different method use of the word assessment. So these assessments are not based on the assessed value. They're based on a new mechanism that we determine in that engineer's report. And it's based on how much special benefit something gets. And so it's not a percentage of the assessed value of the property. So someone could have a property with a high assessed value, but it's all flood irrigation, and we make a determination that the fire risk in this flood irrigation is very, very low. Even though the land is worth a lot, their flood irrigation and their fire assessment, the one we're proposing, would be relatively low. Believe it or not, you guys are all fire experts, so you probably know NFPA. One of the land uses that is the most prone to fire and there probably aren't many in your district, but these temporary storage areas. And so those, even though they're not usually the property isn't worth a lot, they have a high fire risk and they tend to get higher assessments. So it's independent of the assessed value. It's new methodology that we use based on a formula of a number of factors that Jeanette went over. And it's the use, the size, the number of dwelling units, the fire risk of that use, the replacement costs of that use, as well as in some cases, we will also use, because I know up at the Cape Valley, you have some parcels, I believe, that are in elevated fire risk areas and are in the SRA. Sometimes we use that as a factor, that parcels that are at an elevated risk of wildland fire would have a higher assessment. And then the other one we look at, and again, the engineering hasn't happened, so we're still in the preliminary phase. Sometimes we use the distance from a fire station, and that is someone that is closer to a fire station actually receives more benefit because the likelihood of a response to prevent a structure fire, a devastating structure fire, is greater if you're closer to the fire station than if you're a ways away. So there are factors we look at, and we come up with a unique methodology, a rate table essentially for the properties.
Are you then gonna look at each parcel?
Yes, we look at each parcel. And as Jeanette said, we have these huge tables. We start with the county data, and there's about 50 different columns of information: the size, the use, how many dwelling units, all kinds of different things. And then we add about 20 different fields of information based on them as we categorize them. We look at lots of aerials. You're so close. In some cases, we would do drive-bys. We don't do that many drive-bys anymore because the aerial photography is so good. You don't have a lot of tree cover in Yolo County. I'm sure you do in some places, but we've worked in Del Norte County and a lot in Trinity County where you can't tell if there's a house there or not. And that's all kinds of problems. But fortunately, the aerial photography, I think, in Yolo County should be pretty telling, and we'll use a lot of that.
So I think what's probably one of the takeaways is that for each district, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Now, we have taken a stab at sort of grouping like services with like services and geography with geography, right? Like I've been working on this for about a year and a half, and one of the things I keep hearing is that you can't treat winners in Cape Valley like you would treat Democrat. Different topography, different geography, different types of risks, things like that. So the way this process is going to unfold is that each district that participates in this effort, I mean, obviously the county has no mechanism compelling anyone to participate, but for everybody who chooses to participate, you'll have one-on-one conversations with the consultant and county staff. And so that way the conversation can be very tailored to the district's needs. And that's really the idea here. I have another question in the chat here, and it's from Commissioner Yeager, I believe, with West Plainfield. And he asks, what is the cost of the engineering report? I reassured him that the county's paying for it in this instance. But I have a ballpark idea, but I didn't know if you.
Yeah. Typically, it's a great question. A range, typically, we would charge about $25,000 for an assessment. Valerie is our proposal person. Am I about right? What we did in this particular case, because of the efficiencies and that we can have meetings like this, that rate is a lot lower. Is it about 15? What are we?
And this one?
Yeah.
15.
Yeah, so our rate, a typical engineer's report off the street from us or one of our competitors for something like this would typically be about 25,000, but
but then if, like the 5-year, best management practice to update it.
yes,
So I think what they're looking for is what is the ongoing.
Oh, okay, yeah, so.
The county's paying the first one.
Right,
so in
exactly.
5
So if
years,
you went
what's it
through with
gonna
the
cost us?
balloting, there's an annual administration. So each year you have a public hearing, and your district, either the supervisors or your own board, get to vote to go ahead. And there's a couple of things they get to decide on. In California, one of the nice things about it is any rate that's approved, and I keep using the $100 as a rate, that's always the ceiling. Any fee, tax, or assessment in California, you can always go lower. You can't go higher, but you can always go lower. Let's say for one particular year, you didn't need all the revenue. So you said this year, instead of the $100 ceiling, we're going to go $50 for a single family home. So that's one of the things they decide on. Also, we are highly recommending that each of you consider having a cost of living mechanism associated with the benefit assessment. This is very standard. We highly recommend it. If you don't do it, your assessment is worth less and less each year. And so and most people, lots of people will groan and complain about a CPI, a consumer price index, but it really is not diminishing people voting yes for it. They will still vote yes. It's pretty standard these days. And so you get to, and what we typically do to add some control is we say it's can't exceed, when we come up with either typically 3% or 4% in any given year. Now we're exceeding that this year, of course, but typically in California it's 1 or 2%, and it'll come back down to that. So we usually have a CPI that they vote on. You can then, once that engineer's report gets updated with the new budget every year, as well as there may be changes to the parcels and the use. So let's say you have an area that was a vacant lot last year, and this year there's 20 new homes. We want to assess each of those. The vacant lot may have been at a very low rate. It was ag land a couple of years ago, but now we have houses. So we want to assess each of those houses $100. And so each year, the list of parcels changes a little bit. The use changes. There may be subdivisions. Occasionally there's a combination. And so you go through and you do that type annual maintenance. Our firm does provide that. That's a service we provide, but you can do it with another firm, or you can do it on, in some cases, you'll be able to do that annual administration on your own. A typical for something like this, help me out, what, $3,000, $4,000, something like that, somewhere in there. That's a typical for a fire district with 2,000 parcels. And we're going to do an engineer's report. We're going to come to a public hearing. We're going to go over all their parcels. We would typically, the rate on the street, we're probably middle of the pack on that. It would be $3,000 or $4,000.
So for budgeting purposes.
Yeah, something like that.
using
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like
that's right.
$3,000.
Yeah,
per year.
exactly. Some of the districts are so small. Some of you have maybe 100 parcels and there's almost never any development. You may just want to do that in-house, and we could tell you how to do that to save that. But if you have some development and you have a public that are interested in and are going to come to the public hearing, that kind of thing, it's probably a $3,000 annual administration, somewhere in that ballpark.
All right, let me check the
Excellent.
chat. Any questions? Oh, I see.
Oh, good.
Council
Okay.
here.
Yes.
I actually have two questions.
Sure.
One, first one is the public hearing process. Would that public hearing be held at each individual district?
Yes.
Or does the board of supervisors have to go through?
There's a funny requirement. At the end of the 45-day balloting, it has to end with a public hearing, which always seems a little funny because people said, why do you have, everyone's already voted at the ballot, why do you have the public hearing at that time? We do that because that's a requirement right in the law. There'll be lots of outreach and meetings leading up to that, but that public hearing we recommend it is typically in a place that is open to the public within the district boundaries. So we wouldn't recommend having that at the Board of Supervisors meeting. We would find a fire station or a garage or a park or something. We want to do that. Your property owners will only support something like this if they believe it's local. And we just think it's a bad omen and a bad gesture to have it outside your district. So our public hearings will be within the district boundaries.
Hey, John, really quickly, can I jump in real quick? Because I got a private question in the chat, so I'm not going to say where it came from. But the question, I'm rephrasing a little
Okay.
bit to provide some anonymity here. The question was somewhere along the lines of, what if we participate in the process? I actually have three questions in the chat. I'm just
Okay, good,
interjecting
good,
one
good,
right
great.
now. What if we participate in the process, do the engineer's report, we know kind of what it looks like and what the anticipated revenue would be, and what if our commissioners fail to authorize an election? That was one of the questions, so I'm wondering if you could answer that.
Yeah, so that's a decision. That's why we have commissioners. That's why we have boards, and they would have to balance the risk or the lack of desire to go forward with the lack of revenue. And so that's a decision they make. It doesn't typically, and one of the parts of the process that I want to really emphasize is there's lots of discussion before we get to that point. We're going to look at the engineer's report, and some of you have engineer's reports that just need to be updated. There are some things about them that are not contemporary, and we would recommend an update that would be less, that this is really paid for by the county, but it would be less than that 15,000. We'd say, hey, this engineer's report, it's got some problems. We're going to rewrite some of these things. The rates aren't going to stay. Change, we're going to do that. In some cases, they're going to say they're going to want to have a new one with new rates. And then ultimately, as Elisa said, it goes before the board and they decide to not go for it.
When you say the board, though, you mean the Board of Commissioners. We
The
have to be careful with boards.
well, the board to me means if it's a dependent district, the Board of Supervisors. But if it's an independent district, it's their directors, their board of directors.
Yeah, we'll have to figure all that out. In my mind, it would be, if the commissioners have been delegated that authority by the Yolo County Board of Supervisors, it would be their decision.
Correct, yeah. On a dependent, it's Board of Supervisors, and I think there's 4 of those, and everyone else, I believe the governing body legally is the directors for that particular fire district.
You have.
Oh, the
backwards,
four independent, I had, okay, the four independent, though, they each have boards that are elected, am I right about that? And they are the governing bodies, so they would have to vote to approve the, going forward with the assessment. So in those four independent cases, if they decide not to go forward, it dies at that point.
Yeah.
They need to buy into that. And that's a decision that they would weigh the pros and cons and make that decision.
We need to get back to Chief Lawrence, but
Yes.
the second part to that other question, because I think it's a yes or no, is it the intention to have all of these Prop 218s go at one time or to roll
So
them
we're
out
gonna
as they're
talk
going?
about that during next step, but the quick answer is no.
Okay.
We have some phasing we want to talk to you about that's more efficient for you, more efficient for us.
Right, so
You-
they're not dependent on each other though.
They're not
218s,
dependent on
they're
you. So we're
completely
essentially, it's
independent by
15,
district.
right, exactly.
Okay.
It's we're doing our work 15 different times. Now, we typically up and down all of California do 5 to 10 of these a year. We're doing 15 here, but they're going to be in different buckets and different phases and different years.
Okay.
So all of that, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. I'm sorry, you had a second half to your question.
The question was the cost of this. I know the county is paying for the study. Is it
Yeah.
also including the cost of the printing ballots and mailing the return ballots?
It is not, so the cost we gave to the county didn't include that, and that is a subject that has not been determined yet. And it's an additional cost to do that. You can imagine, I will give you a sense, most of that cost is designing that ballot, which is fairly straightforward, and that info guide, and then the printing and mailing and return. So you can take a ballot and maybe you $3 a parcel, something like that. It's not particularly expensive, something like that. And then any tabulation and any outreach. So after the engineer's report process, your additional costs, and I think it's still up in the air how that would be funded, would be the design, printing, addressing, and mailing and return mailing of the ballot, any costs of tabulation, and any costs associated with outreach.
So and one of the reasons that hasn't been determined yet is because I think what we need to do at the county is get a sense of how many districts intend to proceed. So in informal, I think it's fair to say it's kind of the elephant in the room. In informal conversations amongst various different districts have kind of, there are a number of districts who have been fairly open about saying, there's no way in my district we're going to do it to 18. So it's for us, it's a matter of, is it going to be 4 districts that actually take their engineer's report to a balloting, or is it going to be 14?
Yeah.
And the answer is, I don't know. So, I think we need to see as we get down the road what that looks like and be serious about moving forward.
I think that's gonna be tough, because if you're going through every district at a different time, it's not, you're gonna get one point where everybody's making that decision.
Right, there'll be 15 different decisions.
Yeah.
And Elisa brings up a great point. Our role is to help recommend to you all and to the county kind of an independent evaluation of each of you. We're going to work with you and say, who needs a number of factors. Who needs money? If you don't need money, you shouldn't go forward with this. Who needs money? And the other one is we're going to work with you who has the appetite for it. And that may come down to the Board of Supervisors or in the 4 independent, if their board wants to go for it, and political viability. And we have independent ways we can kind of look at this, but a lot of that is going to be input from those of you in your actual district, because you have a sense of the community the best. And so we'll be working with you, and you may say, there's no way. I like the example. If we had one where there was someone that owned 50% of the property.
We have a lot of flood control districts in the county that are like that.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually do a number of,
No, it's dead.
right. We do a lot of flood control districts. In fact, we did RD 1600 very, very recently. And early on, you have a meeting with this big property owner, and you try to evaluate, give them the information, evaluate whether they would go forward or not. If they say no way, no how, that would be very key in our recommendation back to you and to the county to not go forward on that one. Or if someone said, yeah, I think these services are important, I'm willing to invest, and I understand I have to increase my assessment, I'm willing to do it. That would also be valuable. So we will evaluate and work with you to help you, but it's political viability. Do you need the money? Does your board have the stomach for all of those types of things, and make recommendations? Yes, sir.
Have you worked with tribal government?
So we work in rural California, so we have worked with tribal governments. And depending, I know, I was going to talk a little bit about many of our experiences. Actually, the tribal governments have been some of the biggest supporters. Now, those are governments that have a successful resort and our casino. So we have worked with them, and we've actually had good luck and good success working with tribal governments up and down the state. And we think they're an important player in all this. They usually are quite sophisticated, actually, in fire service.
They actually become part of the committee.
They often do. Yeah, they've actually mostly been quite supportive in our experience. Yes, sir.
Now, how about working with contract cities that have districts? Are there different challenges there?
One of the challenges is, well, there's somewhat of, in terms of the process and the mechanism and the balloting, it's not really that different. But there can be a big challenge with communication and buy-in, and different constituents. Some like the fact, gee, we're a rural area. I like the contract with the local city because they're a sophisticated department and they can provide a high level of almost like an urban level service in a county unincorporated. So it's popular. Some people react exactly the wrong opposite way and they say they don't care about us. They're the Woodland Fire District, our fire department. They don't care about little podunk us. We actually more often we get in that on Cal Fire contract areas, and depending where you are in the state, usually Cal Fire is not that popular. So we usually try to make them. So it's a communication and personality issue that we would work with on that in that case.
So then the only other question or comment that I have is, you said it's unique that we would be doing an entire county essentially in one fell swoop. There's economy of scales, obviously, but one of my concerns is that, County Road 98 and County Road 27, for example, is a borderline for 3 districts. And if there's significant discrepancies in the benefit assessment between the 3 of them, the neighbors are talking.
Yeah, no, you're right.
And so strategically, are we looking at going after different districts at different times to?
That in our next steps, we're going to bring up a slide and talk about that. But you touched on something that's very significant because we even have in some districts, I don't think that'll happen in here, but if we have a large district, like I think Santa Cruz and North County, you tend to get different zones. And anytime you have a zone, like a distance from a fire district, that means there's a boundary and this person is paying that and the person across the street is paying different. And so that becomes a big political vulnerability. So to answer your question, we will do this with sophistication and nuance and experience. And if we come up with assessments, and it shouldn't be a problem because generally I would think the service levels are generally the same. And so the rates ought to be similar. But if I've got a $25 a house here and a $250 house there, that's a political problem. And we probably misengineered it and we probably want to look at it. So we'll do that with some sophistication. Yeah, exactly. So we'll look at that. We understand that that's an issue we deal with quite a bit.
All right, I have a question in the chat. And I think this is really more of a question. This is more of a question for the county than it is for the consultants. And in the spirit of anonymity, I'm not going to say where it's from. How do we get around the question of a lot of our constituents already know the county collects money in the way of Prop 172 and the fire districts are not considered emergency services and don't get any, and the residents have been paying that for 20 years. So that's a good question. I think it's a fair question. And here is sort of where we've been with that. We have had a lot of talks. We've had a lot of talks at the board level. We've had a lot of talks between staff and chiefs and between ad hoc committees and the chief subcommittee. There is no adopted position recently by the board on Prop 172. When the board adopted its Prop 172 allocation and formula, it was seeking to backfill revenues that were taken during ERAF shift. If these phrases sound foreign to you, then I would very much like for you to email me or give me a call, because it would take me longer than we have here tonight to kind of explain it to you, but I'm happy to do it. But essentially what the board did back in the 90s was they said, the state took money out of these funds.
we're getting Prop 172 money and we're putting it back in those same funds. So at that time, the county did not fund any fire service. And that formula has remained the same ever since. Now, this whole fire sustainability effort, which I believe kicked off in 2018, sort of centered around the Fire Chiefs Association wanting to take another look at that. It's been a long time. It was the 90s when this was established. We have gone through a lot of conversations, a lot of data, and a lot of analysis. We've done a lot of case studies on what other counties were doing. We've talked about legal risk. I mean, we've talked about everything under the sun. We've talked till we're blue in the face. We went to the board last August, and at that time, the board decided that they wanted to see the districts sort of participate in their own financial sustainability by taking a look in-house. Right? If we've been getting, I run several flood control districts and CSAs for the county. I'll give you an example. I get $39,000 a year from the ad valorem. That number has not changed in about 30 years. Maybe a little bit here and there. Some years it goes up by 1,000, some years it goes up down by 1,000. At that time, when that district got that money, it was $1,500 a mile to maintain levees. Today, it is $21,000 a mile to maintain levees. And I have that same revenue source. This is very common. In August, the board said, before we start talking about Prop 172 or any long-term funding arrangement, we want to see how much of that gap can be closed by modernizing the existing Prop 218s and seeing if there's an appetite for the districts to modernize by maybe adopting a Prop 218. And that's where we are. That is by no means, I don't speak for the board. I'm not a decision maker. I mean, on the scheme of things, the board's up here and I'm so far down here, you guys can't see me over the table, right? I just implement the board's direction. I don't think that conversation is over. I think right now, what the board expects is the board expects those that are interested in pursuing long-term sustainability to participate in this effort to the best of their ability. And I think that the board is also aware, because I know the questions have been asked, that, a district might participate in good faith. The fire commission might, decide to proceed with balloting an election, and by God, it still might fail. Right? So what happens then? The answer is, I don't know. We have to talk to the board about that. I will tell you, in Knights Landing, it took them 3 tries to increase their water rates. They failed twice. Third time was the charm. So that's kind of where we are. That's how we got here. That's why SEI is here with you guys tonight, because this was the board's direction and this is the way we're headed. And again, if you want more in-depth information about all the money moving that went on in the 90s, I have my business cards. You're welcome to give me a call and I'll walk you through it. Okay. Yeah,
let me add, and thank you, Elisa. And let me just add from our standpoint, the county and the committee, the committee of fire chiefs of this effort have been excellent. And we had some very frank conversations, and they brought up they said there's an 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that's Prop 172, because there's lots of folks that feel that money should go directly to the fire districts. Why are we doing this? And I think Elisa did that, described the position of the board of supervisors extremely well. I would add on, and like Elisa, our firm actually does lots of flood control work as well. And as I look out, flood control actually, flooding in California at a state level has been, the perspective of flooding has been way ahead, in my opinion, than wildland fire. We are finally, as Californians, starting to get serious about wildland fire. I believe the model for funding will be similar to the state flood control model. And that state flood control model is typically there's a matching or exceeding local contribution. Subventions, which is a maintenance program in the Delta Islands, because there's no subventions out here, is that right? There's a subventions program. Many of our clients, it's a 10% local contribution and a 90% contribution from the state. My sense is that may happen. And the reason I say, and the reason I bring that up is, as you all make these decisions and you read your community, should we go forward? Is this good? Does this feel funny because we're assessing our people and the county should be paying it? All of that kind of stuff. I would always recommend whatever you can do to get yourself independently, sustainably funded. That's going to pay off in the long term. In flood control, it's a rich get richer. The RDs that have the money and are maintaining more actually get more access, and the poor get poorer. So I always recommend that you kind of look out for yourself. Gee, what can we get locally funded that's ours for sure? And that will allow you to leverage additional funds. Are there additional questions?
Oh, I can check the
Yeah.
chat. What about in the room? And I would too is if anybody has questions, this goes for people in the chat. If you have questions that, I mean, some people are just shy. If you don't
Yeah.
want to put your hand up in front of a room full of people or into a chat, you're welcome to email me. I have cards and my email addresses in the chat, and we can set up a time to discuss, more privately. That's always on the table. We're here to help. I don't see any additional
Great.
questions in the chat.
Let me dive in. Oh, it's already behind me. Okay.
We're gonna do
Yeah,
next steps.
so the next steps essentially is, before we get to this, the next steps would be, we're gonna likely do a survey monkey questionnaire or email out a questionnaire to get some general information on where you're at, your kind of feeling. One of the things to think about is who should be representative to this issue from your agency.
Well, first, you plan to participate.
Do you, well, even telling us whether you want to participate or not, someone has to make that decision. Obviously, the chief should be key in that decision, and you may want one other staff member or one or two board members, something. Think about who, and do it in a balanced way. Who you think would be most representative that can describe and has the best pulse for the community. We're going to ask you some questions like that. And we're going to identify, and we're going to put you all into 3 buckets. And we've defined these buckets as, we believe there's a bucket of you that have the will, the need, and the political viability to move forward in the near term. We know there are some that would like to do this. And for that group, that's bucket number 1. And that's probably going to happen over the next 12 months. It would be, we do a lot of the work in the engineering this year and into next year, and we would probably ballot next May. You'd probably if it was approved, you would get your new revenue at the end of 2023. So ballot in May 2023, new revenue by the end of that year. And so that bucket is, they're poised and ready to go. This makes sense for them. The second bucket is the group that shows the need and may have the will, but doesn't have the political viability at this point. And that second bucket would probably move to 2024. Because that will give us more time to engage the community and communicate. We think there's a third bucket that may not have the need, may not have the will, and or may not have the political viability. There's some areas, and I think Elisa said it, there's some people that have already said to her, there's no way we're going to do this. We would like to engage those groups and go over, or those agencies, and go over and make sure they're right about it. Probably they may have a benefit assessment. We'd at least like to clean it up and make it defensible. And there's probably some things we can do for them long-term, even in that third bucket. So that third bucket may or may not go forward at any particular time. We did a very, very, very draft first pass at this that we're going to share with you right now. Don't kill us if you disagree with it.
And it's not final.
And it's just very draft, but we wanted to do some groupings. And we looked at groupings need. We looked at, a lot of the groupings have to do with geography. It makes sense that some of them, in fact, you can see Esparto, Madison, and Pei Valley, that geographically kind of makes sense. So we have those in the same region, and we put those in bucket number 1. Clarksburg is kind of off by itself, and that one, there's a number of things that line up. West Plainfield and Willow Oak, we grouped together, and then Winters, and those were all our priority 1. Dunnigan, Knights Landing, Yolo, and Zamora, we thought were bucket 2, and East Davis, No Man's Land, Spring Lake, and Elkhorn, we put in bucket 3. There's a number of factors that I haven't mentioned in terms of long-term plans, maybe discussion of consolidation, revenue needs, that kind of thing. So we wanted to just throw that out there. If you want to throw things at us right now or tell us how screwed up we are, you can think about that. If there's some obvious errors or glitches or things that won't work, we'd love to hear from you now or at some time in the future.
Yeah, and if you think that your district, if you think your commissioners
have an appetite and you think that you can't wait that long for revenue,
Yeah,
and you think that you're in the wrong bucket, I would strongly encourage you to reach out, because this is absolutely by no means final.
yeah.
This was our first pass.
Right, and we're just gonna start with this, but we wanted to at least shock you a little bit or let this feel real a little bit and at least have that grouping so you can at least see how we're thinking about doing this. Any thoughts, reactions? Great, so we got it right.
Yeah, we are, we're starting to get pretty over on time. I'm
Yeah.
gonna ask the Zoom one more time if there's any questions. I don't see any, but I'll give them a minute. And then again, you are welcome to reach out to me, elisa.sabatini@yolocounty.org, put it in the chat. If you just want to talk offline or something occurs to you later, more than happy to follow up with you. All the materials will be posted, hopefully within 24 hours. I can't guarantee that because IT has not been friendly this week. And by that, I don't mean the people in the department, I mean the actual infrastructure. Any questions in the room before we go? No?
Great.
Well, I thank you all again so much. I know how busy you are, especially in what is now year-round fire season.
I'm going to put my card, and again, I'll put my cards there. Feel free to reach out to us. Probably you can reach out to me, and we probably get Jeanette as our project leader. And any question, we'll loop you in, Elisa, so you can monitor what's going on. But if you have particularly any Prop 218 our process or what our experience, we're happy to talk about.
One additional question in the chat.
Yes.
So, if a district decides to participate and say they have no Prop 218, but they're gung-ho.
Yeah.
What would be kind of the best case, worst case scenario for them for getting through that? And it's very specific to the engineer's report phase.
Right. So the engineer's report, if they have an existing engineer's report and it doesn't make sense for them to go forward, we'd like to dress it up and improve it. If they are going to go forward with a new mechanism, we will certainly look at the existing assessment.
No, this question was specific to, they have no benefit assessment period.
Then we will.
But they're very interested.
Right. So
from scratch.
we're going to write it from scratch. And that's even the ones that have an existing one, we probably, it'll almost be written from scratch. So if you're going to go forward, we're going to write a new engineer's report for you. If you're not going to go forward, we're going to probably try to clean up your existing one, I would say.
But how the question was, how long would they expect it to take?
Oh, yeah. So the engineer's report upgrade or from scratch is a 3 to 6 month process.
Probably depends on the.
Yeah, it depends on a variety of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I can follow up with that commissioner
Okay.
in particular. I'm familiar with the district. All
Excellent.
right, well then.
I
Great.
have actually one question. You touched on it very, very briefly. I understand the process has to be done every 5 years. Is that true?
So I'm gonna no, depending on, we read the law a little bit differently than what Elisa said. If it's
My response was Yolo County Council's best.
right, so and we would talk to council because we actually, if it's for sewer, water, or refuse collection, there's no question it's a 5-year perpetuity. We feel strongly, and we'd be happy to talk and put forth our case to Yolo County Council that there is not that 5-year requirement, that it goes on to perpetuity. We have fire assessments that are 20 years old. You ballot it once, and that's the heavy lift. Once it gets approved, you just make adjustments to the CPI, the parcels over time. But some clients occasionally want what's called a sunset or an expiration. We usually advise against that. That's only good for the consultants because they get to work again. So we advise against sunsets. Some communities really, really like sunset. So some places you can't win unless you promise them you're going to come back out in 9 years or something. But we try to stay away from that because that's not good for long-term planning. It's not good for the district. Let's go in, get this thing approved, and then it goes on into perpetuity. Great, thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to strongly encourage you to take cookies.
Oh, good idea.
Like any of those people, cookies and rice. Great, please take them. And for those of you on the Zoom, I will be posting materials on the county's webpage, and I'm going to send an email blast out to those email addresses that we have from the. So thank you again for your time, and we will speak with you again shortly.